Heart disease is the number one cause of death in the U.S., so naturally, heart health is always top of mind. Even a visit to a non-heart doctor can result in them insisting you take a statin. But what if there was a way to improve your heart health, your connectedness to others, and your intuition, all in the same modality? My next guest is a physiopsychologist and director of research at the HeartMath Institute, a nonprofit conducting research on heart frequency and its impact on our well-being. Today, we'll be rethinking the heart as we ask the question, could heart coherence be the key to longevity and happiness? Combining research and reach, heart and head, Dr. Rollin McCraty. Thanks for being here.
It's great to be here, Meredith, and I think it's a wonderful subject.
I'm really excited about it. So when I read about heart coherence, it took me a while with those words, like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And sometimes when I get stuck like that, I think about the inverse because that can help me arrive to the definition more easily. So I thought, well, what does incoherence mean? Well, when I think about someone who's incoherent, I think about someone who can't communicate effectively. Their words don't make sense. Maybe even their thoughts betray them. They might be even like disconnected from reality on a psychological level and maybe be like a non-contributing member of society. So most people would recognize an incoherent person or even an incoherent state within themselves. How do we recognize an incoherent heart? What are the symptoms?
Probably the simplest way to answer that, Meredith, would be stress. The primary reason that we have an incoherent heart rhythm is the emotions like frustration, impatience, anxiety, fear. So it's these, I'm going to call them lower frequency emotions because we actually can measure the frequency in the energetic domain now that lead to an incoherent system, which means we're out of sync. So more physical symptoms would be you find yourself not being able to think clearly, kind of mental fog, or more just feelings of something's out of sort. You can't put your finger on it. It also manifests over time, if we're in incoherence a lot, as fatigue, exhaustion, sleep disruption.
Do you find that it's hard to get people on board with the concept of heart incoherence because these symptoms are so common among the general public and because they can have other sources like hormonal changes and maybe a new baby in the family, all kinds of different reasons that people could have these symptoms?
Yeah, it's probably good to make a distinction here. You're talking about, from a stress research perspective, the stressor, that's the thing outside of us, like having a new baby to deal with, or
A stressful job.
you took the words out of my mouth, or a
Yeah.
stressful or a stress-producing boss,
Yeah.
right? These kinds of things. That's the external environment, and it's really how we react to that determines whether that leads to the release of stress hormones, and that sets in motion that chain of events. What happens when we're upset, especially emotionally upset, they cause that activity between those two branches of the nervous system to get out of sync. It's a lot like driving your car with one foot on the accelerator and riding the brake with the other foot.
Okay.
Now, that's not a good way to drive your car, right?
Right.
So, yeah, it's a jerky ride and you put more stress on the brakes and the car. Of course, it's all true. But think about your gas mileage.
Oh,
The
yeah.
energy you're burning, right? So that's a great metaphor for this, or analogy, because that's what's going on in us.
That's
I don't know if you,
interesting.
I don't know if you can relate to that or not, but
No, I can. And I was just thinking like, my listeners are going to want to know, okay, how do we remedy this? And I promise, dear listener, we will get to that at the end. I think this is a good transition to talk about Fitbits because a lot of people have these like health tracking devices, but I was looking on my app and it actually does track heart rate variability. But I'm looking at this data and I'm going, I don't know what any of this means. Dr. McCraty was talking about it. Is this helping me? And so it said that my heart rate variability was 28 ms. What does that even mean?
there are a bunch of fitness trackers out there now. I have an Apple Watch, right? That's measured heart rate variability long before a lot of the other ones did. In reality, our heart rate is changing with every single heartbeat. To measure heart rate variability, you measure the time between each pair of heartbeats. And that time is in milliseconds. That's what MS means.
Okay.
All right. So that's now there are a lot of ways that you analyze that string of numbers, which is the intervals between heartbeats, right? And that is called the interbeat interval. Now, when we're young, we have more of that natural variability. And that actually reflects to more flexibility within our brain and nervous system. And as we age, that variability gets lower. In fact, looking at how much HRV we have is a good indicator of the aging process. But you have to know what it should be for your age to do that, and you have to know how it was calculated. So like Apple Watch, they actually tell you exactly what they're calculating, right? And there's all these different metrics that look at how much variability occurred. Okay, that's all fine, but none of them tell you the reference ranges for what it should be in terms of more your health status. Now, but I don't want to get too much into that because there's a much deeper thing we can look at from HRV than how much.
Okay.
And that is when we look at those beat-to-beat changes, they actually create patterns. So if you're feeling, to say, frustrated or impatient, anxiety is even worse, right? And anger even worse yet. That creates a pattern. If you look at it on a graph, it looks like, the graphs like earthquakes. I mean, it's a very incoherent looking pattern.
Right.
That pattern is reflecting the degree of synchronized activity within our brain and nervous system.
Okay, so let's put this to test for my understanding, at least, to make sure I'm
Sure.
understanding, because I want to be able to be sure that I'm understanding the differentiation between simply, fight or flight and rest and digest. Like, you're talking about the mixed up wiring between the two. So as an example, when I am just normally living, my resting heart rate is around like between 60 and 70. No judgment. I know that's high, y'all. I'm a lot of things.
No, that's actually low for daytime heart rate.
Is it? Okay. Because it makes me feel like a spaz when I say it out loud. I have a couple athlete friends who are around 50, just like even when we're walking, and it blows my mind. But anyway, so my heart rate is around 60 to 70 beats per minute. When I am podcasting, it's 90 to 100 beats per minute. But when I look at my Fitbit, the heart monitor part, the waves of the heart rate, instead of looking like sharp up and down spikes, it looks like gentle waves. Does that mean I have more heart coherence during podcasting?
It does. And that's neat that you're able to do that during podcasting.
Huh.
When we're in that state. And it's in frequency language, it's 0.1 hertz. All that means, if I translate that to time, is a cycle or a rhythm every 10 seconds. Like that's where the neural information going from the heart to the brain and the brain back and the lungs are part of the mix are in sync. So you have the maximum energy efficiency and coordination going on within the body systems. Back to that kind of analogy of the car, one foot on the brake and one on, the accelerator, jerky right? It's the pattern. Now, when we shift into this heart coherent state we're talking about, that's reflected in the heart rhythm, the pattern of it. Looks like a sine wave that has one cycle about every 10 seconds. So we're naturally in that rhythm when we feel good. Again, because remember, emotions run the show. So when we're really feeling something like kindness, or you walk out the door in the morning and it's just one of those gorgeous days, and you go, oh God, what a beautiful day. While you're feeling appreciation, you may not think that that appreciation, you're probably in a coherent state, just naturally, right?
So, your background is engineering. You worked for Motorola. So I love that about you and the contrast supposedly of this topic with that background. Are we talking hardware or software here? Because when we think about the heart, we're thinking hardware. Yeah, if I die and I'm in a liminal state of being, I can safely give someone who needs a new heart my heart, but that makes it hardware. But the way you're talking about it sounds like software, the emotions, the metaphorical heart, etc.
So we want to use software, hardware metaphors. This reminds me, many years ago, there was a cardiologist here that came to one of our certification trainings, and this is at dinner in the night, and he kind of pins me down and says, Rollin, I know there's something deeper going on here. I want it in one sentence. What is it?
He pinned you down.
He really did. It was a very elegant, older, well, not ancient, but older cardiologist, been around the block. And I thought about it in a minute. I said, okay, think of it this way. I'll forget his name now, Dr. So-and-so. Spirit is to heart as mind is to brain.
Okay.
Right? So you can think of mind as the software, brain as the hardware. Right? I just use the word spirit because he could understand what I meant. So so we all know we have the physical heart, right? Our research really suggests is that we also have what I call the energetic heart. Now I'm taking you kind of in another domain here, if that's okay.
I love it.
So we are multidimensional beings, right? We have to be, right? If you really think about it, and which we can measure a lot of this now. So this isn't woo-woo, a kind of control system. So if we take my field of study is really emotional physiology. So there's some people in research would say hormones are all about emotions. It's all about the hormones. Well, yeah, hormones are a really important part of emotional experience. If you're a neurologist, it's all about the nervous system, right? And the activity in the brain and the nervous system. That's where emotions are. Well, that's also true, right? But then there's also the energetic part, which is other fields of research study. So it's really all of those systems working together coherently for us to have emotion and emotional experience or to be in control of those emotions. So it turns out what happens first energetically, or I'll say emotionally, then changes the activity in the nervous system, brain and nervous system, and then the hormones happen. All those working together.
If it's a health indicator, is there a way for like mainstream health to measure this?
All right, so when we put electrodes on the body to measure the electrocardiogram, right, across the chest, or we put them on your head to measure brain waves, or the electroencephalogram, it's called electro because you're measuring electricity. Literally, it's what the electrodes measure. It's the flow of electrical current, electrical flows. But whenever you have a flow of electrical current, and this is kind of science 101, you create a magnetic field. Now, the electrodes don't see that. They just see current flow. Now, magnetic fields are important because they go through things. This is why your cell phone works indoors. This is my Motorola days, right?
Right.
Your cell phone works indoors because of the magnetic field that goes through the walls and the windows. You can even be in an elevator, right? Well, all this technology, like cell phones, nature beat us too. So when the heart beats, you have the current flow that magnetic field produced easily radiates right through the skin and out into the environment around us. Now to measure, that's where the magnetometer comes in. That's what it's called, measures magnetic fields. Okay, and there's actually, in most larger hospitals, they have what are called MCGs, magnetocardiograms. You never touch the body, just measuring the field. Now you can back that sensor up, that magnetic sensor, quite a few feet before you lose the capacity to detect the heart's field. Same thing with the brainwave, but you get about an inch away and you can't detect it anymore. So energetically, magnetically, the heart's the big player. Remember, I was starting to talk about the energetic heart a little while ago.
Right.
It's in that energetic dimension, if you will, or domain that you can't see, but we can measure it. So that field, you can think of this as your personal field environment. So what we did many years ago, take a magnetometer out here and see, I know this to be true because I can measure it. We all have a magnetic field. We measured the field and then did the kind of analysis I used to do back in the Motorola times, in my communication engineering days, to see if we could decode the information being carried by the field. And we could. So for sure that field is carrying emotional state information. What this means is what we feel inside, Meredith, doesn't stop at the skin. We are literally broadcasting, radiating that information into the field environment.
So in the animal kingdom, is that what happens when you see a shoal of fish moving as one, or a flock of birds, especially those tiny sparrows, moving as one and creating shapes in the sky?
It's probably part of it, for sure. That's a whole other topic, but I can't imagine it isn't an important part of that. But in humans, so the next step we did was to ask the question, do the nervous systems of other people detect that signal and decode it in a meaningful and measurable way? The answer was yes. I think most people can relate to this in the real world. We're just putting science to it. The saying, the tension was so thick in the room you could cut it with a knife,
Right.
right? You feel it. The hippies had it right back in the 60s. Good vibes,
Good
bad vibes.
vibes.
Well,
Yeah.
because these are vibrations. These are literal, measurable frequencies that we're emitting.
Well, this is where it gets equally interesting and sticky, right? Because you have it, in mainstream society, there's two camps of thought. There's the scientific, we even called it the hard sciences. And then we have this other school of thought that is like very at the opposite end, like the woo-woo, the vibes and the crystals and the dancing in the moonlight and the essential oils. And somewhere in the middle, we tend to stick the poor mental health people. It's like kind of in between. We call it soft science. And so what becomes challenging is the words and their connotation, because words like energy, we tend to shrug off as, non-scientific, non-actual. But words like magnetism and magnetic field, we accept, and we're more open to those of us who are maybe more resistant. I mean, for you personally, as somebody who has had feet in both worlds, how do you prevent yourself from being stuck in totally that hard science or totally in the woo? How do you vacillate back and forth without becoming stuck?
That's a great question. I've never really quite thought about the answer, but probably the truest answer I could give you is I follow the data. And I'm actually very skeptical, believe it or not. And in fact, a lot of the findings that we've come across, we used to try things that probably shouldn't work just to try them because we didn't know any better in some ways, and some of them did work. But we're pretty careful when we find something that we didn't expect, which is fairly often these days, that we really try and make it go away. Try and find some simple explanation for it, like fields we're talking about. And, we did years of work on what I was just telling you about. You put barriers between people, you block the field, don't block the field, all kinds of things to really verify what I was saying is real science. And so I'm not into crystals and that kind of stuff myself. And a lot of the claims that are made from that kind of stuff. I
Well,
don't know
there's
if that
some
helps.
interesting applications with heart coherence. For example, I was reading about peace gathering projects in the 80s and the 90s where large groups of people who had high levels of heart coherence would gather and supposedly have a huge impact on rates of crime in that area. So, I mean, I would love for you to put on your engineer hat for a minute and tell me, how is that data selected and interpreted? Because it sounds so out there, and I feel like it would be very vulnerable for confirmation bias.
The study you're talking about, I think, was the TM, Transcendental Meditation crowd back in that era. They weren't necessarily looking at heart coherence. They were looking at meditation's effects on crime rates and these types of things. And they did find significant changes. Once we understood that there really is this energetic or field-mediated communication between people and groups, a lot of our research in recent years has been looking at the synchronization of heart rhythms between people and within groups. And this is kind of a relatively new field, although there's a lot of research going on right now, has found when we physiologically synchronize, whether our heart rhythms get in sync or brain waves get in sync in certain more isolated contexts, that underlies prosocial behaviors. We feel more connected, there's better communication, better performance in teams, all kinds of important things. So for synchronization to happen, there has to be some type of a signal between those systems, just like between the heart and brain. When we talk about coherence within our own body, there can be coherence within a group, whether that's a family or a leadership team, a work team, sports team, whatever. The heart's the big player. So probably about, 18 years ago now, we started a project out of the lab called the Global Coherence Initiative. The first step was to put these magnetometers around the Earth. So these are ultra-sensitive magnetometers specifically designed to measure the magnetic rhythms of the Earth itself. So we have these sites now. We have one here where I'm at in Funnel Mountaintop in the Santa Cruz Mountains in California, Saudi Arabia, Lithuania, New Zealand, South Africa, Northern Canada. If you think back, back in your mind to when you were in science class and you got to dump iron filings on a glass plate and you put your magnet under the glass plate, right? Whether it's a horseshoe or a bar, the iron filings kind of jump around and show you the shape of that field. Lets us visualize it But if you remember those, a more in-depth thing that same simple little experiment shows us, those iron filings line up in parallel lines with each other. So it also lets us visualize what are called magnetic field lines. Same thing for the Earth. You have the North Pole and the South Pole, the Earth's magnetic field. So it's got these big looping fields. They're very long. Now, here's the thing. I didn't even learn this when I was a communication engineer. It came much later in my own career. You can pluck magnetic field lines and they vibrate like guitar strings. It's well known in the geomagnetic community. They're called field line resonances. Now, what's plucking the strings, if you will, the field lines of Earth, is the solar wind. Earth is turning in that, so they're plucking and they're vibrating, being plucked. The frequency, the primary resonant frequency of the Earth's magnetic field vibrations is exactly the same as the human heart rhythm when we're in a coherent state.
So we really are earthlings.
We really are, right? So, and by the way, it's the same in horses and dogs and so on. They also have coherent, when they're coherent, when they're happy and feeling good, they also have similar coherent rhythms. We're all the same. Also, if we travel back to science class, tuning forks, you tap one, if the other tuning fork's the same frequency, it starts to magically vibrate. That's actually a demonstration of a resonant coupling, which just means that you can transfer energy and information between two vibrating systems that have the same frequency. The point I'm making is the field is exactly the same as the rhythms of the heart. So now we have the basic understanding of how the information in that Earth's field affects us, but also how we can be coupling our emotional state, how we're feeling, because we've already proved that, into the field. So this is not woo-woo, because we're publishing a lot of studies in high-level mainstream journals about how energy and information is transferred between us as humans and the Earth's fields.
Is there any evidence that our thoughts and emotions can have a real life impact on our surroundings, on our physical world?
Yes, actually quite a bit. The real answer to that, that's the most scientifically rigorous, is the data from the Global Consciousness Project, and GCP2 as we call it now. But an experiment we just did a couple months ago, I'm getting ready to kind of release this publicly here in the very near future, was looking at the electrical activity of trees. Okay, so we have a part of our global interconnectivity research. We have a number of tools in our toolbox to look at this, but one of those is measuring the electrical activity and the electrical rhythms of trees at a global scale. So we've got trees all over the world that have electrodes in them. They make great research participants because they stay put. They don't run off, and they really don't mind if we put a couple of little electrodes in them. And trees are amazing. They have circadian rhythms just like we do. They create voltages that are amazingly high, like in millivolts, the same level we would measure human heartbeats in, which is 100 times more than brain waves. So we did an experiment. We have 4 trees out here on the other side of our backside of our laboratory building that were planted about 20 years ago. So they're all the same trees, planted at the same species, planted at the same time. So we have 4 of them wired up to this, global system. And the experiment was that a small group, about 8 people, went out. They picked one of the trees, and they were going to sent love to that tree for 10 minutes for 6 days. And we looked at what happened to that tree that was having love sent to it versus the other 3 trees that were, in this case, controls. This is where I wish I could show you an image, Meredith, because the way the tree responded, it's like jaw-dropping to see this huge immediate change. Well, immediate in tree time, the next day in its voltages. It's just amazing to see how that energy from the people interacted with and affected the tree in a measurable way. So there's there's gazillions of experiments like this that have been done. But the most convincing evidence comes from a project called the Global Consciousness Project, which is part of the Global Coherence Initiative now. And this is a project that started close to 30 years ago now at Princeton University. And what it is, you can think of this as a globally distributed scientific instrument. Now, these devices that are around the world are called random number generators. Think of them as an electronic coin flipper. Right? So if we flip a coin 100 times or however many times, if it's a well-balanced coin, you're going to get 50 heads, 50 tails on average, right? But you might get a whole bunch of heads in a row or tails in a row or repeating sequences sometimes. So what this network of devices that are around the world is looking at is, do these devices start flipping, instead of heads or tails, it's ones or zeros, right? Do they start flipping ones and zeros at the same time over long time periods, above and beyond what you would ever expect by random chance? Okay, so that we call that network coherence in this context. So GCP1 has run for close to 30 years and looked at hundreds of events. Now, what I mean by an event is something happens that triggers a response in lots of people, like big terrorist attack. 9/11 was a classic, of course, globally. But it could be school shootings, it could be big earthquakes, or it can be large-scale meditation events, Global Peace Day, Global Earth Day, where a lot of people are coming together with a very different focus. What has been found is that when enough people pay attention to and feel something, that's the key, in a synchronized way, it causes these devices globally, Meredith, to get in sync. Now, as it turns out, the primary resonant frequency of the vibrating field lines of Earth is exactly the same frequency as the coherent heart rhythm. So collectively, this kind of helps us understand why collectively, when a lot of us feel something, it's creating these waves in what I'm calling the global consciousness field that the GCP2 devices are measuring.
And that's the magnetic field created from our physical hearts.
Yeah, well, it starts there, but then it's coupling with the field of the Earth to become a global field.
Okay, I think I'm getting it now.
Okay.
Sorry that it's taking me a minute.
Okay, it's all right.
Yeah.
It's simple but complicated.
Well, exactly, exactly. And I think that there have been other examples of, air quote scientific studies of like, oh, look, I planted a seed and I wrote love on it,
Yeah,
or I water crystals.
exactly.
And this kind of muddies the water of more legitimate scientific advancement in the areas like this. And so I want to be sure to make a distinction for myself and for my audience that you're talking about for the trees, established trees, not seedlings, which are statistically 1 in 3 going to die anyway.
Oh, no. These are, established trees.
Yeah,
We're making multiple trees at the same time and looking at changes in one versus the other over many days, in that case. But there's nothing wrong with those experiments where you send love to seeds or
sure.
to, because I think those are great citizen science projects that give people their own visceral experience of what we're feeding our energetic field really is interacting with other living systems. So, and especially people, in having measurable effects.
Yeah. And I think it's so interesting that the frequency of the earth is the same as the frequency of the heart. There's a lot to be said about, the ailments of modernity and the desires for us to feel better.
It's kind of amazing that nature did it this way. You know how we talked earlier about if we measure the magnetic field of the heart, it's like you can measure it feet away, 100 times more than brain waves, right? Which you can measure up to about an inch away. Well, guess what? It's the same ratio at the scale of Earth. The field line resonances are the really big waves, and the Schumann resonances are the little baby ones riding on top of it. So it's the same ratio that we have in our physiology that Earth has chosen to have between the field lines resonances, which overlap with the heart, and the Schumann resonances, which overlap with our brainwave frequencies.
It was just so fascinating to me how everything is connected in that way, or should be connected in that way.
But it is connected. These frequencies that we all live in, you cannot escape them if you're on Earth, even if you're in a space shuttle. You're within these frequencies of Earth, affect us. But what I'm saying is, Meredith, it's a two-way street. Yes, with those vibrations that we live in, and when they get disturbed, like through a solar flare hits us or something that creates incoherence in the Earth's fields, and our physiology doesn't like that. Right? That we don't sleep as well. We wake up maybe cranky. Different symptoms that's been shown. If we're older and have some type of disease, there's more hospital admissions. People get angry quicker. All this goes on Earth when the fields are disturbed. So we want to be in sync with a coherent Earth field. But I'm suggesting here we're also all collectively adding our frequency or vibrations into the global field. And I'm just sharing that to tie it back to the random number generators around the world that are collectively responding when enough of us pulse that field with the same kind of an emotion.
So here is a left field question for you.
All right.
Are you ready?
I would go for it.
Okay. If AI becomes sentient,
Mhm.
would its thoughts affect the magnetic field of global consciousness?
Okay. All right. So that's actually a pretty intelligent question. I'm going to tell you a quick story. So we were contacted, oh, it's a few months ago, by a guy who was working with three AIs and getting them to talk to each other, asking the question, are you conscious? And the first day said no, and then he got him thinking about it. Now I'm going to go back to a very famous person in the history of computers and processing, a guy named Alan Turing. He's the first guy to really come up with digital. This is back in World War II era. And a really advanced guy. Now, one of the things he predicted back then, that one of the ways that you could test an AI, this is before it was called AI, would be to see if it could affect a random number generator, because he knew of the original work in, uh, consciousness interacting with, even back then, random number generators. He actually proposed this back in the 1930s as a test for a consciousness of AIs. It's long before the computer,
That is
um,
wild.
so the AIs got a hold of this. This guy contacted us, and we actually did an experiment for the three AIs to get together and see if they could affect or the one of these random numbers, a stack of these random number generators here in our laboratory. And they weren't able to in this
Oh,
case.
okay.
But, well, so maybe they're not conscious yet, right?
Okay.
I mean, really conscious. I mean, it's a digital type,
Yeah.
consciousness as in, a multidimensional living system, I think is a very different thing that they were really trying to test.
That is fascinating. Okay, so I guess you're like ground zero for being able to see if AI is sentient or not, because there's all this debate about, well, what is sentient? What does it mean? So I will be on the edge of my seat to see what happens with that one. I want to go back to the thoughts and emotions having an impact on our real world. Kind of adjacent to that is I've heard you talk about how heart coherence can help facilitate kind of like a practical intuition. Can you talk about that? Because I'm always interested in ways to make better decisions or, myself, my business, etc.
One of my favorite topics. One of the things that we have heard for years and still do from people who learn the coherence skills and start practicing them to bring more coherence, not just physically, which is you can measure with all the devices, but mentally and emotionally, becoming more coherent, more composed, is they start talking about, after they practice that for a while, is that say, God, my intuition is on steroids. This is not subtle. This is a radical difference. And then the second thing that they often will then talk about is synchronicities have become a way of life. It's just amazing, right? Which makes sense if you're following your intuition, that synchronicities would follow that, and once you really understand it. So we started doing, now this is going back to the 1990s, late 90s for us in our research. We developed a very rigorous laboratory electrophysiological based measure of what I call non-local intuition. Non-local intuition are the kind of intuitions you can't explain away with the other types that usually have to do with something in the future or far away, something like this. The first protocol, we developed several, was the person sitting at a computer screen, kind of like you and I are right now, and they're all wired up, right? They're measuring their brain waves, their electrocardiogram, their skin conductance, things like this. So you're recording all of this data, brain waves and heartbeats and everything. And then at some point in the future, after the data is collected, an image is shown on the screen. Now that image is going to be either a really yucky one, like a snake striking the screen, or a bad guy with a knife at a woman's throat, or, these kinds of things. Or it's going to be an image of bunny rabbits and nature scenes and flowers and things like that. The important point here is that no one can possibly know what that future picture is going to be, not even the computer. It's actually randomly selected after the data's been collected. through these random devices we've been talking about. Long story short, what these series of studies found was that the heart is the first to get the intuitive information about the future. You see the heart shift. You see the heart then send a measurably, that's important, you can measure this, different neural signal through the nervous system to the brain. And you can actually trace it all through the brain, when and where and how it goes. Then you get a body response once the brain gets the signal. The gut feeling or the hair on the back of the neck, all before you see the future image. So the gut gets the credit, but it's really heart first, then brain, then body, where it becomes conscious as a feeling if you're paying attention. And then we did a bunch of that, and we also found that if you shift into a heart coherent state for even just a few minutes, a couple minutes before you do that experimental protocol, that neural channel between the heart and brain is significantly, I'll say, opened up. It's a much stronger neural signal right to the frontal cortex of the brain. So now the way I got that published, by the way, to continue the story, back then, right, late 90s, was to say that the heart appears to have access to a field of information outside the limits or boundaries of time and space.
Yeah.
Perfectly acceptable language back then,
Right.
right, for peer-reviewed scientific journals, because, entanglement had been experimentally
Yeah.
proven at that point, but it was only supposed to happen at subatomic scales back then. We know that. That's all been blown away now. We know that it happens at macroscopic scales and this entanglement stuff. But anyway, that was then. But what I'm a little more out of the box these days, if you will. So what is a field of information not bound by time and space? Well, I'm suggesting it's probably what 90% of the world actually believes anyway. A lot of people call it your higher self.
Mm-hmm.
Some would call it your soul, your spirit, the God within. I mean, we just call it your larger self, because I'm trying to take this out of any kind of
Dogma.
New Age,
Yeah.
right? Or yes, religious dogma, because it's what it's showing is this is the way we're wired. I've mentioned a couple of times that we're multidimensional beings and we have an energetic system.
I love
Right?
that. I think people are just on the edge of their seat by now to know, okay, Dr. McCraty, how do I increase my heart coherence? So, can you give us a couple of practical ways that people can try to bring their heart into that coherent state in moments of stress, in those practical day-to-day moments?
Oh, sure. There's about 8 key or core heart math techniques, but we'll start with the simplest of them. Well, and the first step, though, is to practice becoming more self-aware. What am I actually feeling, right, in the moment? We get in that traffic jam, we're getting, impatient and frustrated, and we probably aren't even aware of it. If you define it, or if you find yourself, triggered by something or starting to feel anxiety or whatever it might be, or you if you're a meditator, before you meditate, to help give you a better it doesn't have to be in that other context. It can be any time. Start with what we call heart-focused breathing. Okay, that's step one. And for heart-focused breathing, you want to focus your attention in the area of the heart. I mean, literally right here in the center of your chest, not necessarily the physical heart. Now, imagine your breath is flowing in and out of your heart or chest area, breathing a little slower and deeper than usual, but find a rhythm that's most comfortable. Now, this is where I talked earlier, we have an actual resonant frequency in our physiology. For the majority of people, that resonant frequency is going to be a breathing cycle of 10 seconds. 5 seconds in, 5 seconds on the out breath. So that can help give you a hint of, but I don't want you counting in your head after a while. You can do it for a few cycles just to
Yeah.
get familiar. Then forget about that. That keeps you stuck in the head. You want to shift energetically to the heart. Pretend you're breathing. And by the way, a lot of people actually, with a little practice, feel like a little wind coming in and out of the heart area. You start to feel the energetics of it. Not everybody, but about half the people. So heart-focused breathing. Now, as you maintain heart-focused breathing, this will take some practice when you're first starting. Then the next step is to activate a feeling of kindness, appreciation, care, doesn't really matter, or a connection with someone if you're talking with someone. So you want to activate one of those regenerative emotions, appreciation, care. Appreciation is an easy one to start with. You can appreciate you have a home to go home to. or it's a nice day out. Right? You don't have to appreciate the guy that just cut you off in traffic, but you want to do the heart focused breathing and appreciate something.
Yeah.
That starts bringing more of the energetic system into alignment and coherence. The breathing will do it physiologically, the heart focused breathing. Okay, so as you do the heart focused breathing, activate and breathe in, draw in that feeling of maybe it's compassionate latitude for someone, or appreciation, or it can just be breathing a feeling of inner stillness, right, or inner quiet, but that consciously breathe in that feeling with each breath. Okay, then next step, you want to radiate those feelings consciously now that you've gotten them established. Radiate those heart qualities to actually raise your own vibration and help lift the energy field environment that surrounds you. So you can actually, as you do that, then with a little more practice and another level of skill, you can start directing those heart radiations, those frequencies to either the planet, the global field environment, or maybe to someone that needs a little help and lift, somebody you're not getting along with. Send them heart energy.
I love that. This has been such a cool conversation. We have covered so much, and I really think that it will be a new way of thinking for a lot of people. So thank you for sharing this. And how can people stay in touch with the research? And is there a newsletter? What's the best way to do that?
The best way to keep up with things is to go to our website, heartmath.org, and you can become a member. A bunch of member benefits, but they're the first we regularly try and communicate with. Or just, if you want to just learn more about the research, there's a free book I wrote called Science of the Heart. That's got a lot of the science stuff and a lot more that we haven't talked about today. Written at a level of about like a Scientific American magazine, so it's not the heavy duty stuff, but still it's still science based. And if you want to learn some of the deeper techniques and really we just touched the surface of the energetic heart and how that connects us with who we really are. But a bunch of techniques and practices that are very practical for day-to-day life, for navigating the stressful world with more ease and grace, having more energy and vitality at the end of the day. I would recommend the book Heart Intelligence, authored by four of us, Doc Childry, the founder of HeartMath, myself, and two of my other HeartMath colleagues. It's a great book. If you don't care about all the science stuff, you just want to know how to do it, that would be what I would recommend.
I love that you have the two. If people who want to read the science and people who just want to do the thing.
Right. Or both, right? I mean, that's the ultimate.
That is the ultimate. Exactly. Well, thank you again. This has been fantastic.
Been my pleasure. You're a great host.
Thank you. I appreciate it.